Can you hear me OK? All right. I was going to attempt the jump, but it's Friday afternoon, so I figured the steps were the smarter way to come up here. Great to see you all. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Alex, partner at Lightspeed. Been at Salesforce Ventures prior to this for about 8 years, where I actually worked very closely with Julie. And excited to be at Lightspeed, where I'm helping us double down on SaaS. So what we're going to talk about today is a new framework that we've been, just before that. Yeah, what we're going to talk about today is a new framework that Lightspeed has developed around how to think about this new era of SaaS 4.0 and what the opportunities are for startups, how to think about incumbents. So we'll spend about 10, 15 minutes just going through that. And then really excited to have Abe, who's the founder and CEO of Typeface, one of our portfolio companies. He's sort of the perfect person to have this conversation because he just started Typeface last year, and his background will speak for itself, but you'll see why it'll be a very rich conversation. So without further ado, you probably know Lightspeed, but for those that don't, we've been investing in generational companies for about 20 years now. Our roots are actually in early stage enterprise investing. Today, we also do consumer, healthcare, and fintech, but the real bread and butter of the firm has always been enterprise investing, and that's why this community is so important to us at the firm. We'll keep questions at the end. So thank you so much. And I actually couldn't hear the question, but we'll keep questions at the end. Thank you. We're a global platform. I'm curious, actually, how many of you are based outside the US? Hands up. That's incredible. I'd say about half the room. And it speaks to the sort of community and the fact that SaaS today is global. And as a firm, we operate as a single cohesive group across the US, Europe, India, Israel, China, and so delighted to back entrepreneurs in SaaS across the world. Needless to say, at Lightspeed, we love SaaS. That's why we're all here, and you can see just some of the amazing investments in entrepreneurs that we've been very fortunate to partner with over the last 20 years. I'm sure many of you are either customers of these companies or certainly have come across them. So with that,
So yeah, as Alex mentioned, we've been investing in enterprise software for more than 20 years now. And I think what's been remarkable to us is really that over those 20 years, enterprise software has been incredibly resilient and continues to be so today. So why is that? Think about it. JP Morgan today has more developers than Salesforce. L'Oreal, the beauty company, has over 1,000 employees with data in their job title. And John Deere, the agricultural manufacturing company, has over 4,000 developers as well. So every single business strives to be a technology-first company today, and enterprise software really went from just being part of the IT budget to touching the entire organization: sales, customer success, operations, and HR. And that's why we're so excited about it. Plus, cloud applications, a huge important part of this whole sort of growth, is still growing super fast today. Over the last year alone, cloud applications, public cloud, as part of the IT spend, has tripled in 1 year. That's incredible. And that's why Alex and I still spend so much time in vertical SaaS, thinking about disruption of not as digitized industries like supply chain, for instance, and workflow automation as well. But the real elephant in the room is obviously generative AI and sort of the impact of that shift on the SaaS community as well. We see sort of 3 buckets, and that's at the risk of oversimplifying a little bit, but really excited about, A, the model layer, and we do think there's going to be more than one foundational model here. Secondly, the enablement stack, infrastructure, so that actually enterprises are able to adopt these technologies safely and also efficiently. And then lastly, where, again, we spend a lot of our time, the application layer, and vertical SaaS is going to be a big part of that. But the point that I really want to drive home here, and that's, I think, really important, is the real opportunity of generative AI is really enabling industries that so far have been very slow to adopt software and have been very services heavy. Think about everything we're seeing right now in legal tech, accounting, and healthcare. That's where we see the real shift towards a new era in SaaS that Alex is going to talk about now.
Yeah, thanks, Julie. By the way, curious, how many of you are building in Gen AI as a sort of theme? Okay, about a third of you. Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, part of our view, by the way, is that there is an incredible moment of opportunity right now with everything happening. Julie sort of laid out the broad trends behind this. But so much of what's sort of the history books will say about this era is being written right now. And so we've taken a step back at the firm and tried to think about how to sort of piece together where we are. And a big part of that is looking at this at a historical basis. So taking a step back, the first era of cloud was really back in '99 when companies like Salesforce, where both Julie and I used to work, sort of pioneered this whole shift in cloud computing. Of course, CRM was not a new category. There were existing databases that did this. They just did it on the cloud, on-premise. And so the real innovation was taking that traditional database and pushing it up in the cloud. And so we think of that as sort of the 1.0 era, where SaaS was really about the system of record. You move one over in the SaaS 2.0 era, that was really the system of engagement. And what we saw there was, all of a sudden, it wasn't just recording and storing the data in a database. It was, how do you activate that data? How do you take advantage of it? How do systems start talking to each other, actual applications connecting? And so companies like Slack and Twilio on the communication side, companies like MuleSoft on the API economy, and just a whole plethora of that next generation of software companies coming on stage. Then, maybe about 7, 8 years ago, we had the early innings of AI. The first sort of automation of, hey, how can we drive more intelligence? And in our view, that was the real precursor to sort of this Gen AI movement. That system of intelligence was really focused on how to drive a bit more automation in the core application. A great example of that are companies like Moveworks on the customer service, IT support side, and then Gong on the sort of call recording and engagement side on top of Salesforce. And now, finally, we're in this fourth era, which is really, really exciting. And we're calling that the era of cognition, where it's not just about actual automating a small part of the task. It's really about creating an entire new workflow where work gets done. And to us, we still don't know who the category winners are going to be. That's supposed to be I think some of the color codes got screwed up. But you can see it's a big empty box on the right. And hopefully some of you here will go fill that. And certainly we think Abe will with typeface.
Obviously, it's also important to talk about sort of the implications for software companies as we shift into this sort of fourth generation of SaaS. And I'm talking about both large enterprises as well as young and small startups. The first part is sort of creativity is being completely democratized. What does that mean? We completely redefine what it means to create in the first place. What is creativity, actually? It kind of breaks down the entire barriers of creating, and that's why we're so excited about it. That means it touches music, film, art, but it also means completely changes how we build products and how we build user flows. And I think there's a lot of creative potential that is being unleashed here. Secondly, we've seen sort of an evolution from being data-driven in our recommendations and next best action to a more sensing approach, as we like to call it. What we mean by that is instead of sort of suggesting the next best videos to watch based on your preferences, why don't we start with actually creating that video that matches your preferences the best from scratch? And then lastly, this is truly the era of personalization. Obviously, that means for founders building that you really have to, the user expectations are higher than ever. You really have to match a huge level of personalization for every single user. But what excites me is the opportunity here in education, healthcare, also the content ecosystem. It could be that finally now we're getting close to a point where personalized healthcare is becoming much more available to a much larger part of the society. But with all of this opportunity, with all of this opportunity, obviously also comes sort of a huge responsibility. This is an ecosystem that is still moving incredibly fast. We're having a lack of ownership to some extent, and sometimes even don't really understand what's happening under the hood technology-wise. And so I think as company leaders, as organization leaders, we really need to ask ourselves, what are the implications of such personal data being used and shared in this large amounts for our employees, for our organizations, for our customers and users? And I think we see actually a big stack, technology, infrastructure also emerging around that topic. But something that we love to spend a lot of time with is, as Alex already mentioned, that we're also going to discuss in our panel after this, is how the dynamic between incumbents and startups has shifted by the advent of generative AI. What we mean here is that so far it's been almost enough to be very, very agile, fast-moving in a new space, and kind of the first one with a small company to go after it. That has shifted now. Today, the ability to access large amounts of proprietary data and have huge distribution power have become so much more important. And so shortly we'll discuss a little bit how that changes the playing arena for startups and incumbents alike.
Amazing. Thank you. So one of the benefits, as venture investors that we have is we get to meet a lot of companies. And actually, the flip side is if you're a founder building, one of the hardest things is you're sort of, within your four walls, really focusing on building your business. And so with, the benefit of the last year and having seen a lot of companies both in our portfolio and companies that we've gotten the chance to meet, we've taken a step back and thought, what are sort of the big dimensions that when we think about backing companies gets us excited in this sort of new era of cognition, as we're calling it. And there's 5 areas that we've identified. And we're going to go through each of these real quick. So the first one is data. And is it proprietary data, or is it data that's publicly available? Our thesis is that it's a lot more valuable if you can take advantage of data that's proprietary and private. Great example of this would be if you're building an inventory optimization company. What's more relevant? Is it just the weather patterns in terms of predicting when someone might buy a T-shirt or ski gear? Or is it actually being able to integrate into the actual transaction history of the merchant, seeing all the historical patterns and actually driving insight for them that way? And so that's what we mean by private data here, not just sort of what's available to other companies as well. I think the simple way to think about this is if you have access to it in the public domain, incumbents, large technology companies also do. And so really trying to think about where are the sort of unique data sets that you can develop with your customers to drive more of that insight and automation. That's number one. Number 2 is frequency of interaction. The beauty about software is that it really powers workflow. But not all workflows are created the same. And our hypothesis here is that frequency is going to matter a lot. There are some tasks that happen once a month, once a quarter, maybe even once a year. There's other tasks that happen literally on a daily basis, or at least weekly. And our excitement in terms of backing the next generation of software companies are those that are really focused on that frequency of interaction, because we think it can drive a lot more engagement and a lot more value for customers. The third is, what's the actual product that you're building? The comparison of starting a company today and building product versus 20 years ago. 20 years ago, you had to raise 20 million just to get an email server up and running, right? It's incredible how much now is available. And that's true of the Gen AI movement as well. We've all played around, I'm sure, with ChatGPT and OpenAI and just the amazing technology that's at our fingertips as consumers of this. But the so what of that is product gravity matters a lot. And just having a thin wrapper around an existing workflow, we don't think that's going to drive a sustaining advantage. It's a lot more about the deep integrations that are required into traditional systems. It's more about the workflows you can drive. It's the community you can build around that product. So in our view, the gravity of the sort of depth and gravity of that product matters a lot. And so if you think about depth, try to explore not just sort of the initial use case, but where you go from there. And that's one of the big areas that we've been excited about in the companies we've backed. The fourth, this is an amazing opportunity to drive 10x improvement in terms of what actually happens from a use case, product, collaboration perspective. I think today, decision makers in software and IT, they're inundated with tools, companies. There's more than, in an average company, about 4,000 SaaS applications. And so ask yourself, how can we drive a 10x improvement, whether it's through the product and actual experience, whether it's through the business model, whether it's through the community you can drive. This is going to be a tidal shift, I think, in terms of what can actually be built. And those companies that drive that sort of significant improvement are going to be the winners. And then last and not least, this ties a little bit to sort of the SaaS 3.0 versus 4.0. What is it that you're automating? If what you're automating is a sort of nice to have for a customer, sort of more in that low-level intelligence where, yes, it could help their business, but it's not going to move the needle, that's going to be a very different outcome for the business and for you than if you're sort of automating what's a more, what we call high-level automation, that drives meaningful ROI. And so as you think about building in this era, really go back to customers and what's in it for them. Why should they pay attention to this? So that's our framework. It's clearly a super exciting time to be building in software. We've been investing as a firm for over 20 years. I've been investing in software about 15, and I have never been more excited about what's to come. But obviously, it's also a challenging moment because there's so much innovation happening quickly. Incumbents are taking advantage of that as well. And so as startups looking for opportunity, this is a really unique moment. So with that, let's actually dive into a builder that today is at the forefront of this, is at the sort of in the trenches of building with Gen AI, and is actually disrupting himself. Abe, I'd love it if you can please join us on stage. Please join me in welcoming Abe.
So, Avi, first of all, thanks for coming and joining us.
Great to be here.
As we said, CEO of Typeface. But before that, you've had an incredible career already, and we'll talk a little bit about why that makes you such an incredible panelist as well for this topic. So you were the CPO and CTO at Adobe. If that wasn't enough already, you before that also started and led cloud businesses at Microsoft and Oracle. And you sit on the boards of companies like Schneider, I think Dropbox as well. So, again, I think we would be hard-pressed to find someone else that can talk about both working in super impressive large corporations in the technology ecosystem as well as startups. But
thank you for that. That sounds much more impressive than it feels, but sure.
But maybe let's take a step back, how did you arrive at, in the technology ecosystem? What point did you know you wanted to build amazing products, on and on and on? What was your start, basically?
Yeah, first of all, thanks for having me here and really good framing. I think you covered a lot of the themes that certainly we are kind of experiencing as kind of we're building the business. I think for me, it's actually, a lot of times when you have these kind of discussions, sometimes the expectation is to answer with like, oh, there was a well-laid plan and kind of was very clear from the beginning. Actually, the reality is very much a lot of coincidental moves. I happen to always love software, was self-taught in programming, ended up in the first job where there was a project that didn't even have a name, and that became Java, which was a programming language, and I didn't even know I was working on something. And so a lot of it is a series of kind of coincidental moves. But probably the one common theme across all of them is I've always gotten more excitement and energy working on kind of what I call flag planter type of activities rather than role builder, where there is no well-defined path, there is no well-defined market and product, and you kind of get to go chart some new territory. And so that's probably the one common theme. Doesn't always work out, but that's probably the fun part of it.
Yeah, I think, by the way, that story is very common. This sort of like accidental, some of the best founders we've backed have that sort of, they go into domain and to them it's obvious, but to the rest of the world it isn't because of that path. Where did the idea for Typeface? Maybe you can sort of share a little bit about your vision around the product and the category and how you thought about what you wanted to build there.
Yeah, it's interesting sitting here today at SaaStr when Gen AI is all the buzz and everything is kind of centered around Gen AI. Around November of 2021, I was still at Adobe as CTO leading a lot of the products. We were already investing quite a bit on AI, but just not the Gen AI form. And then I happened to get an early view into some of the transformer-based kind of diffusion models, GPT-1 and 2, and they were not quite there. But if you could extrapolate, you could see that the world of software is going to fundamentally change, because in some ways the last decade with the cloud, and you talked about the SaaS 1.0, 2.0, or 3.0 waves, the world of data has gone through a complete transformation. If you look at all the unstructured data, big data companies like Snowflake, Databricks, amazing companies have been built on the side of data. And then at Adobe, we always kind of sat at the intersection of creativity and kind of science. And what was clear to me that the world of content in the enterprise is just completely stuck in the dark ages, because there wasn't a 10x breakthrough as you were talking about. And GPT, even in an early form, was very clear that if this continues, the hardware acceleration, software acceleration is going to get to a place where entire world's content architecture for companies is going to go through massive inflection point. And so for us at Typeface, really the genesis was the same way when original printing press happened, there was only one font. And until typefaces were invented, you couldn't really personalize and tell your story. And so our thesis was, if this underlying GPT and foundation models are kind of the AI equivalent of printing press, you need a personalization layer for every company, every person to tell their story in their own voice, in their own brand. And so we said, let's go build that software.
Is that where typeface comes from?
That is the name,
I didn't
actually.
realize that.
That is not a story I usually, yeah, but that is the reason why it's called typeface.
Can you also remind the audience when you started this journey again? Because it's actually incredible in terms of timing.
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible in some ways the rate at which the industry is moving. I mean, I have been fortunate enough to be part of cloud transition at Adobe or mobile. This one is at least 10x faster in its way it's moving. We actually officially I started a company May of last year. So roughly 15 months ago, which in some ways is super short. We are still obviously super early. But I remember ChatGPT, Stable Diffusion, none of the things that happened. And when we started the company and we started talking to customers or some early investors like Lightspeed, one of the questions was, well, what is the platform you're going to use? Because none exists. And there is no platform that you can build a company on. To Lightspeed's credit, Ravi, who is kind of founder and CEO there, certainly saw the arc of where it could land. And literally, when Lightspeed and I started the journey together, there was a thesis, there was a conviction, but ChatGPT had not happened. And so we thought it's going to take 3 to 5 years. And yet here we are. Within a year, everything has changed.
Incredible.
That's amazing. You know, I'm curious, a lot of founders, I think, looking at the space that you're building, would have thought, incumbents are just going to go and do this. And you've now, with your career, have been on both sides. And you've seen plenty of startups. You've been in really the iconic companies of technology. How do you think about sort of spaces that are interesting for startups to go and explore? And where do incumbents actually have the advantage? Like as you sort of, maybe in your own journey with typeface, but even more broadly, you know, for the audience today, because there are obviously distinct advantages and disadvantages. How did you sort of like frame that in your mind for typeface?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I don't know that there is one right answer. I would love to hear. You guys have an advantage where you get to see the broad picture. I think we get to kind of go deep through our vantage point. But for us, it really, I would probably start with what's common across incumbents and startups, at least for me, that over the years I've seen, is whenever there is a disruptive shift, you have, at least for me, you have to start with a deep product thesis. Can you build something that is a deep technology and product moat? I think you called it the thick or heavy application layer. Actually, that's very similar across both these companies. If you look at companies that are fortunate like Adobe or Microsoft, there aren't many companies which have products that are 20, 30, 40 years later are still considered gold standard, like Photoshop. And the reason they are is they have a deep technology moat combined with an exceptional product user fit, where the users love the product. So first, I would say that's actually something we think a lot about at Typeface, which is what is that product truth and what is that product moat? Because no other, I mean, there can be a lot of hype, there can be a lot of capital, there can be all kinds of PR, but if you don't have that product truth, that I think is true across both of these. But then where it starts diverging, one of the things I saw consistently at big companies, and I think companies like Adobe are still better at transforming themselves over the years, but when you have existing businesses and existing customer base, your ability to disrupt your own business takes a significant amount of commitment and discipline. And not every incumbent can do that. And even those that can do it, they cannot move as fast enough or adapt fast enough. So one of the advantages, if you have a core product truth, then your ability to adapt and fundamentally make offerings in the market that the incumbent will never make because their economic incentives are just misaligned in the short run, I think is one of the fundamental things. I mean, at Microsoft, I worked on Azure version 1, and when I was there, one of the challenges was, could we or should we offer Linux-based VMs when you have a $60 billion Windows business? And even though we knew technologically that was necessary, it's not easy to, when you're a public company. And so I would say that economic incentives, incumbents can leverage that to their advantage when incumbents actually have it misaligned in the market. So that's kind of one of them. But I think also speed of change. I fundamentally think, and this is what keeps me up at night, is our only weapon at Typeface is the rate at which we can change with the market has to be 10x faster than the rate at which an incumbent can change. Because they have 10x, if not 100x more capital, more reach, more customers, but their ability to change is the one thing we can do faster.
Super interesting. I don't know if you both agree with this, by the way, but I found that whenever folks that haven't worked at a big company talk to me about a big company, they think of it as a monolith. they're like, oh, a Salesforce, why does Salesforce do or not do this? Or why does Adobe do or not do this? And actually, in the case of Salesforce, there was really 6 or 7 different business units.
Yeah.
And each of them, by the way, would be like one of the largest public SaaS companies on their own right. But as a result of that, it's not like there's like, of course there's an overarching strategy, but there's a lot of sort of resource allocation that has to happen within those departments, domains. And so, to your point, it's like finding that thing that you can go faster than anyone else with that focus. It might be something interesting to the big company, but it's not something that today they're prioritizing.
And the people who have that DNA, there are people like that in those companies. I mean, I was one of them for many years in big companies. But those people typically have to fight the internal kind of status quo to get these new products out. And they do, and they try, and they succeed a lot of times. So I do think you're right. It's not a monolith, kind of one giant fabric.
Right.
I think when we talked about the session and prepared a little bit, you mentioned, you talked about the term data uniqueness and how important that is also when you're building a business in this ecosystem. How should we think about that? First, as an incumbent, you might have more access, but then also as a startup, how do I get there, right? When I have this cold start problem a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, that's a fascinating question. And I know you talked about the public versus private data sets. And this, I would say, even for us at Typeface, we are through that learning journey ourselves. So I don't think the final chapter on this is written yet. But the one thing that is very different about Gen AI, I mean, not only is the technology different and it's fundamentally about algorithms, not just procedural code, is for the first time, software is not just about codifying your intellectual property through a bunch of automation and algorithms, but it's actually about extracting unique patterns through data sets or deep domain specialized kind of verticalization. And that's actually one of the hardest things for an incumbent, because at least most incumbents, they have a lot of that data, they have a lot of those assets through their customers, but they didn't build their businesses with that architectural pattern. But they are sitting on that gold mine. Yeah. Now, if you're a startup, your problem is you don't actually have access to that data. And so the best strategy, at least in my mind, is one of two things. Can you, in fact, partner with these incumbents? And I know we'll talk about that a little bit, because they are sitting on that gold mine, but may not always have ways to extract value out of that, at least right away. But then there are a lot of end customers who actually are looking at Gen AI. Like we are working with one of the largest consumer electronics goods companies. They operate in 90 countries. They sell TVs, refrigerators, washing machines, all appliances. And they have tremendous amount of data. They just don't know how to connect that data to the world of generative AI. And they're very nervous about handing over those crown jewels to OpenAI or Microsoft or Google, because they're worried that their crown jewels then suddenly will be in the hands of these incumbents. So they are actually extremely excited about working with startups, because they want to push the limits of their assets by working with companies that are not as big a threat as incumbents are for them.
That's fascinating. Yeah. So it's almost like the fact that you're small, new,
is an advantage in that case.
Advantage. Wow.
How did you set yourself up though, like to be able to get access to the data, let's say from security perspective, and especially if you're just super young, all the requirements that large corporates have to work with you, it's a lot.
Yeah, it is. And I there are days I wish I had a simpler answer to that question. But one of the things I will say, and maybe this is a little bit from the trenches, I mean, as exciting as Gen AI is, and as exciting as the pronouncement at SaaStr every session may be that this is going to change the world overnight, I actually think it's going to take a long time. I think this is an undeniable fundamental shift. But I will remind people, when I worked on Azure version 1 in 2008-9, and 15 years later, cloud is only still 30% deployed. The world is still 70% on-premises. Doesn't mean cloud is in the right direction, but these things take time. So first I would say the notion of compliance, copyright, safety, do you kind of have ethics and bias, all those considerations are as much important as any innovative demo or a feature or exciting, cool new thing you can build with Gen AI. But we are finding, if you look at Typeface, which I did not think when I started the company, we just hired a world-class chief security officer within the first year of the company's existence. I don't think that's what most companies would have thought they would need, because the enterprise dialogues are not just about the positive aspects of Gen AI, They're all about, tell me how you're going to indemnify any IP copyright violations of these models. Tell me how my IP is not going to leak back into these public platforms. And so I do think if you're a startup, back to your question, which I really think is very insightful, which is you may think that that is not an advantage an incumbent has, but that is actually a fundamental advantage incumbents have with these enterprise customers because they are used to speaking that language. They know what the traps are. They know what the CIO cares about. And they don't even have to build any features. They can just freeze you out based on those aspects, which I think is, again, something incumbents have a strength on. But startups can actually go there. It is a real investment. I mean, we are investing a lot in that in our engineering roadmap. I wish we didn't have to. But if you're selling to large companies, that's kind of part of the journey.
Yeah. So just to put it into finer terms, how many people are in Typeface? How big is the company today?
It's still pretty, I mean, I still think it's grown quite a bit, but it's still pretty small. It's around 60, 65 people.
Okay, 65 people, and you already have a chief security officer.
Yeah, I mean, we hired him. He was probably employee number 35.
Okay.
We have grown quite a bit in the last few months. But yeah, and he's been incredibly helpful because a lot of our conversations with big financial insurance companies, I mean, again, for us, we serve those kind of companies. So that's why it's important. If you are targeting consumer or small businesses, maybe that's not as relevant. Even though I think in AI, I think the topics of safety, ethics, compliance, copyright laws are as much part of your software development practice as having a killer user experience.
Yeah, what I love about how you frame this in your mind is sort of the image that's coming to mind is like a toolbox that's empty, and you're sitting there going, what do I need to put into this toolbox to like stand a chance and go win?
Yeah.
And it's just fascinating how in this era those dimensions are so different. You know, if we had seen a company 5 years ago of 30 people with a chief security officer, I think our first question would be like, what do you need a chief security officer?
And yeah, but one other thing I will say, and I think both of you, in fact, have a lot of experience in this, so I'm actually curious. One other thing when I started, if you had asked me a year ago, who would we partner with? Again, that's another thing startups typically get advised, like partnerships with the big guys is completely not the right thing. You will distract yourself. It will never work. Just go do your own thing, which, by the way, focus matters. But the way Gen AI space is going, and kind of you touched on this, I think incumbents are not going to stand still. This is too big an opportunity. The economic price is too big. I don't think it's going to be one winner take all. As much as OpenAI had an early start, amazing work, every big player is going to end up owning their share of this prize in the coming decade. Whether it's Salesforce, Adobe, Microsoft, Google, they are not dummies. And so the question then becomes, if you're a startup, can you just ignore all of their investments, their strategies, or can you somehow capitalize their interest and their excitement around this space? For Typeface, what we have done, which so far has worked out well for us, like this chief security officer, within the first 9 months, we struck deep partnerships with Microsoft, Google, and Salesforce. Wow. And all three of them are actually deep technology partners. But I do think distribution is the new product mode in the Gen AI. You cannot just build a product. I know there is a lot of, I'm sure, talks here around PLG and how PLG, you can just win with PLG. Yes, that's great. I happen to believe you are ultimately going to need distribution advantages like data. And these big companies have massive distribution advantages. So would love to, I know you guys both had vantage point on that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I think, the biggest, misconception is that startups think that large corporates sort of want to destroy startups, and there's a sort of like David and Goliath. And of course, competition is there, and ultimately there's an economic prize. But I think, when we were at Salesforce, I'd love your perspective on it. I always felt like Salesforce was looking for partners to accelerate it. Like the DNA was more a rising tide will lift all boats. Now, of course, if you're sort of building a direct CRM competitor and you're in the same deals, that's challenging. But for most companies, it's not the case. And actually, there's surface area where a rising tide can lift all boats. How did you see?
Like, besides sort of distribution power and access to potentially even data, and I think even just the brand association sometimes helps to lift you up from being 10 people in a room that no one has heard of before to kind of having a bit of a aura around you of, let's say, a Salesforce or Google, whatever it is, and it can be really, really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And in fact, at least for Typeface, having that association, has been incredibly valuable because they have given us access to enterprise customers. As enterprise customers talk to them, they introduce us, bring us in the conversation. Then it's up to you. You still have to go fight and win those battles. I mean, this is the, in a weird way, the life of a founder, which is you have to simultaneously live with that contradiction. You want to partner with them, you want to exploit their distribution, their advantages, their brand, but you obviously have to be mindful that they have their own self-interest. They are going to compete. They are going to go build every feature you have within a period of time. And can you find those areas within their ecosystem where they just won't have the incentive to go and you go there first? But all things considered, I would still go all in on a startup that can move very fast, but leverage and exploit the incumbents' fear. One last thing I'll say, especially with Gen AI, incumbents are extremely excited, but they are feeling extremely like startups. They don't have a Gen AI strategy. They don't have a Gen AI product portfolio. They don't know where their customers are going to go with this new technology. So they are trying to figure that out themselves.
Yeah, it's kind of, I love that framing of the moment of time is moving so fast that they themselves are sort of, I don't want to use the word desperate because that's probably the wrong characterization, but there is an urgency, I think, behind large incumbents today. And I think startups that capitalize on that, and sort of what the image I'm hearing here is like sort of hitch the wagon a little bit to the bigger boat and then try to take that tail speed as far as it takes you.
And if you can use one against the other, at least one thing we decided early on, we don't want to become hitched to one wagon because then they get a lot of leverage over you. So if you could get more than one, which I know is not easy and hard, but then really you find yourself in a unique spot because they're kind of competing to push you into their ecosystem.
Maybe last question from me, and then you might have one as well. And then we should open it up, actually.
I thought so.
We have mics here as well, so we'll ask a couple more questions. We'd love to hear from you. I'm just curious on the time commitment that took to pull that off, in terms of how involved are you on the partnerships? I think it's an area that a lot of founders haven't done. And as they sort of think about like what to outsource to like a BD person on their team, how involved you were. You talked about 3 of the largest companies in software. I'm sure it took a bunch of your time. Like, how did you draw that balance internally?
Yeah, this one is unfortunately, and like anything else in startup, it's all matter of trade-offs. First of all, I do think I was kind of personally the program manager of these partners because at the end of the day, when you're a small company, it's hard to get access to these dialogues. They're not going to listen to, they'll barely listen to a founder and CEO. They're not going to listen to somebody within a company that they don't know has any kind of influence. And so, yeah, at least in my experience, for first couple of years, you can't delegate that. Which is unfortunately the real risk because you are taking valuable cycles away from product building, go to market, getting your own customers to trying to land these somewhat speculative partnerships. And if you can't land them, you've just wasted all your time and energy. So I do think you have to be mindful of that. But I would say, for us, for the first 15 months, I was the BD person myself. Yeah. We just hired actually a very senior partnership person, but that's after all the 3 partnerships are kind of now in place and he's the best person to go drive them to scale.
But I just wanted to say that actually I think that's a really important point. Actually, I think in landing those, it's really important to have that very senior support, but then there's a lot of work also in supporting them and then having a partnership manager. We saw that at Salesforce now and again. It really makes an impact as well.
Oh, and without a doubt, like I am absolutely the worst person to now drive it to this because it's a very different skill set, very different muscle. But I do think the risk, and I'm sure we made mistakes here quite a bit. You could end up spending a lot of your cycles away from something else, and so you got to kind of balance that, I think.
Should we open it up a bit? I know we could keep talking forever, but we want to make sure that you guys also have the time and chance to ask a few questions.
Yeah, let's do it.
So, if anyone...
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind just coming up to the mic, maybe quickly introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Sheila. Quick question for you. Which sector do you think is most promising? Financial sector? Is it, education, travel, government? Because in this conference I've heard, some people say that find a sector that's safe to fail. Instead of failing at a big project in a big sector, try to find something that nobody will notice. So wondering, because you get so many startups you're seeing, and plus you have a lot of experience, especially working with financial sector, which do you think is most promising going forward?
you have a view? Or
I mean, I can go. I can certainly share, but go ahead.
I think there's a couple ways. Oh, there you are. Sorry. There's a couple different ways I think to answer the question. I think one is like, how big is the opportunity? And I think certainly some sectors are bigger than others. Well, for example, healthcare, financial services, retail, construction. Like these are areas where if you think about the number of companies, the spend of software, like vertical SaaS is not new. If you think about companies like Toast that has done it in hospitality, companies like Viva on the pharmaceutical side, company like Encino in financial services, they've been able to go very sort of top to bottom and deeper into the workflows in a way that frankly a Salesforce never could. Salesforce was a big part of Encino because of that sort of difference of horizontal versus vertical. So our view is a vertical application can capture more of that share. You know, you often see about 20, 30% market share for the leader in vertical places versus maybe 5 to 10% more horizontal. So really, I think the question is, if you think about a 30% market share in your industry, is that big enough? And if you feel like the answer is yes, you should go build there. But that's how we would sort of frame it of what can you capture?
Yeah, I was going to say the same actually. I think the important part is that biotech software for the longest time had a little bit of an issue of not having maybe enough time or not enough spending power in the IT budget, but that has changed. And I think that's where we got excited because it continues to be the markets where workflows are extremely targeted, data is extremely sort of specific, and for GenAI, that's the perfect use case, and with an increasing market size, we're super excited there.
I mean, the only thing I would add, first of all, I completely agree with the verticalization, deep workflows. I will just say two things, and the second statement is going to contradict the first statement. But the first one, we started with a thesis, which is retail, CPG, travel and hospitality, certain industries where the regulatory compliance or PII or those aspects are not as severe, is easier for a startup to go start. And so it was really more about not market sizing, but our ability to serve that market. And so we said we are going to start with that. We are going to start with marketing because marketing use cases tend to be a lot easier than anything that has financial compliance and stuff. While that has proven to be the case, those industries are jumping on GenAI very aggressively. One where we were wrong, we said no early on to financial services and healthcare. By the way, two of the biggest industries for any software category. But that's because we felt our compliance and all that stuff wouldn't be up to par. I think we have been pulled by customers into financial services. They actually just have too much money and they're jumping onto the GenAI bandwagon. And so there we had to adapt. So my one last thing would be, have a thesis, but be willing to change your thesis as soon as you get customer signal telling you that you're wrong, as we were.
Yeah, I love that. And maybe one last thing I'll share on this, because we could probably chat for hours on vertical SaaS, but Lightspeed just made an investment in a company called EvenUp, which you may have come across. They automate the entire work of a paralegal in the injury law space. Now, traditionally, software was not, selling into that category was not that interesting, because effectively spend was so small. But now this era of cognition, what EvenUp can do is almost 70-80% of what a paralegal can do. And so all of a sudden, the value proposition is a dramatic, it sort of puts it upside down. So thank you for the question.
Hey, my name is Sudhit. I'm the founder of a company called Flowworks. We are building an AI that helps you operate any softwares without you having to learn it. Softwares like CRM, ERPs, which are complex in nature. So my question is, how do you build, as a startup, as a small startup, how do you build partnerships with larger companies like Salesforce, Microsoft, or Google?
You've just done it.
Well, but you guys may have, you spent, first of all, I don't know that, honestly, the real answer is, I don't know that there is one simple kind of a 10-word formula to kind of say, if you do this, that will, two things I would just say. First one is going to sound obvious but hard to do, is obviously relationships. You have to have some way, and that doesn't mean you personally have to have the relationship, but through your investors. One thing I will say, one of the biggest reasons why I went with Lightspeed in kind of we were actually not even fundraising at that time, but you do want partners who actually have that kind of enterprise Rolodex that has that kind of ability to access, call up CIOs, call up. So one, access matters if you're trying to do these relationships. And if you don't have it, get others in your corner who can get you there. So that's probably my first relationship thing. But the only other thing tactically I would tell you is figure out whichever company you're thinking about, they all have structural weaknesses in their market and they know that. And if you have an answer to that weakness, they are going to be super motivated. One thing I'll just say without going too specific, when we started, we realized that the race at the foundation platform level is going to heat up so much because OpenAI had a head start with GPT-4, and we knew Google is not going to just sit by. But that meant Google was actually extremely motivated to actually find partners who were willing to bet on their nascent GenAI strategy. And so we said, okay, let's go. So I think going to number 2 and 3 in incumbency is not a bad idea because they are still massive companies.
Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Ben, co-founder of Cyberbox, and thank you for your time. It's been very interesting to listen in. I just had one question. As we all know, generative AI and the OG ways to make content has just produced a lot of content, and brands just have so much to choose from today. So how have you seen them make decisions around what to launch and understand what's actually resonating with their audience overall? And how do you see the shift as we get more opportunities to create content with these brands?
I feel like you're perfectly positioned for this.
I mean, I think what you just said is actually a real active conversation in every one of our sales engagements with customers, where one, they're trying to figure out that this Gen AI sounds cool, the demos on Twitter look good, but what's the ROI and how do I measure what am I going to launch? I don't think customers have figured this out, and I don't think startups have figured. I think it's still early days. I think is the real answer. What seems to be working for us at least is kind of developing some sort of a what we call generative AI maturity model, which is giving companies kind of a step-by-step playbook of let's identify one targeted part of your business, let's identify one targeted business process, and essentially drive either 10x speed of content creation or drive dramatic cost reduction and start in a very narrow scoped way. So I think I would say for us, because otherwise what's going to happen is like the first wave of mobile apps, everyone is going to roll out Gen AI in excitement and they won't get any ROI, and then they'll kill those pilots and then you will lose the business. And so for us is having a very clear business sponsor saying what's the clear ROI. That is actually one thing that's different about Gen AI, by the way. The value orientation is coming in very early in this kind of a shift. At least that's, does make your job slightly harder to sell because you can't just walk in, show a cool demo and get a PO. Because you have to then say, in your business, this is the one thing we will go improve in the next 12 months.
And as I can mention what we did, we built a co-pilot for creative research, where we actually testing real people online that they have all this content now to really understand true engagement. So I'd love to talk to you.
Yeah.
The only thing I would add, by the way, is I think, one of the things Salesforce did exceptionally well is they went from being a tool to being a partner to customers. And what I mean by that is a lot of customers wanted to go sort of on this digital transformation journey, didn't know how.
Yeah.
And Salesforce sort of became like the fabric of like, we will hold your hand and take you on the journey. I actually think there's an amazing opportunity today for companies in Gen AI to do that again. Because most customers we talk to, whether it's Schneider or Morgan Stanley or you name it, big companies today want to innovate in Gen AI and do that step, they just don't know how. And so I think companies that sort of provide that fabric for them and will help will be hugely impactful. You can't. Yeah. I think we're out of time, but maybe we'll take last question. We actually can't hear you all that well, so.
Fascinating conversation. Thank you very much. I'm just wondering about Gen AI, threatens a lot of the different types of positions. A lot of times it threatens internal initiatives that companies have. So I was wondering if you have talking points when going into a sales conversation on how to sell your product in a way that is not, depending on who it is you talk to in the organization, they're going to receive you differently. So how do you make your reduce that kind of friction?
Yeah, I can take it. First of all, I think first I would say that's a real risk and that's a real issue. So ignoring it and not actually confronting it in your conversations with customers is not a good idea because there are stakeholders inside these companies, there are external agencies who have business relationships. So first, I do think that is a real, I think you had a slide around all other aspects of Gen AI, privacy, ethics. I think job displacement, reskilling, training is another big one that companies are going to grapple with. So first, I think it's a real issue. What we have found, and by the way, we are still early, so I don't want to over-project how much we have learned, is the fear is very real, but when you actually engage in that ROI construct, what most companies end up doing is actually not reducing those people, but actually saying, now we can do more with the same people I have. And so actually it's rarely the case, at least in all the customers we have deployed, We used to produce 10,000 pieces of content last year, but our business need really was 50,000. And this software, if we can make our 5% team perform like a 10% team, that's amazing. That doesn't mean there won't be some displacement. What we are finding is the dialogues very quickly shift towards, oh, this will allow us to be more productive with the same investment and the same team, at least in the growth companies. I mean, that's who are, those are the companies you are selling to anyways, because if they're not in a growth posture, they're probably not looking to buy this kind of software.
Yeah, amazing. Well, look, thank you so much. I want to be mindful. I think there's drinks, or I saw a Casino Royale session out there. So thank you so much for joining us. And Abby, on behalf of Lightspeed, thank you so much for your insights.
Thank you both.